All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a figure who is described as, and get this, the most brilliant intellect of all the scientific heirs of Marx and Engels.
Wow, that's high praise.
It is, and I think you'll agree when we get into it. We're talking about Rosa Luxemburg. And what's so fascinating about her is this fusion of thought and action. She wasn't just a theorist, she was deeply engaged in trying to change the world. It's a prime example of what it means to act as philosophers.
Totally agree. She really embodies that idea. Her intellectual work was always linked to her political commitments and her engagement with the major issues of her time.
Exactly. So to understand her, we need to go back to her roots. She was born in Poland under Tsarist Russia, part of a progressive Jewish family, experienced depression from a young age, which might have sparked that rebellious spirit.
Yeah, I mean, by her teens, she was already involved in revolutionary groups. You can see it in official reports, too. They talk about her rebellious attitude towards authorities, even cost her a gold medal at school.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, and eventually it got too risky. She had to leave Poland in 1889, ended up in Zurich.
Makes sense. Zurich was a hub for all sorts of radical thinkers back then.
Exactly. And that's where she really dove into academia, studied philosophy and law, ended up getting her doctorate.
What was her dissertation about?
Poland's industrial development, interestingly enough, but even that was politically charged, argued against Polish national self-determination at the time, a stance she actually maintained throughout her life.
Interesting. So already seeing that link between intellectual work and political ideas from the very beginning.
Absolutely. And Zurich's also where she met other key Marxist figures like Leo Jogich's, her partner and collaborator in setting up the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, the SDKP.
Right, the SDKP. So even in these early years, there's this commitment to not just thinking, but acting on those thoughts, acting as a philosopher, you could say.
For sure. Like, take her dissertation. It wasn't just some detached economic analysis. She was making a deeply reasoned argument about the downsides of nationalism for the working class. That's crucial. She's analyzing the world looking for fundamental principles.
Got it. So then she moves to Germany in 1898, lands right in the middle of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. A crucial time, right?
Oh, yeah, a real turning point. She dives right into this huge controversy, the revisionist debate, sparked by Edward Bernstein.
Ah, Bernstein, the one who said, "The final goal is nothing to me, the movement is everything."
Right.
That was a big challenge to traditional Marxist thinking.
Huge. Bernstein essentially argued that capitalism had adapted. It wasn't going to just collapse like Marx predicted.
Okay, so what was he basing that on?
Well, he pointed to things like credit expanding, the growth of cartels, and the fact that workers were getting more voting rights. He saw these as signs that capitalism wasn't about to implode.
Interesting. So what did he propose instead?
He basically said, look, social democrats should focus on progressive change through parliament, through reforms, rather than clinging to this idea of a revolution.
Yeah.
Gradualism, not upheaval.
A big shift.
Yeah.
So how did Luxemburg respond to this?
She wrote this powerful rebuttal, social reform or revolution, and she argued that it wasn't a choice between one or the other.
Ah, so she wasn't totally against reforms.
Not at all. She saw reforms as important for improving the lives of workers and for building their strength and awareness as a class.
Okay, so where was the disagreement then?
She insisted that reform and revolution were fundamentally different in their goals and how they worked. Reform operates within the existing system, while revolution aims to completely overturn it.
That makes sense. So it's not just about tactics, it's about the ultimate objective.
Exactly. And what's really cool and shows her acting as a philosopher is how she tackles Bernstein's economic arguments head on.
Give me an example.
Well, Bernstein saw credit and finance as stabilizing forces in capitalism, but Luxemburg argued that they actually made crises worse. She said financial capitalism encouraged speculation, creating a disconnect between the real economy, the production of goods and services, and this more volatile financial world.
Ah, I see. So she was already recognizing the potential dangers of financialization.
Definitely. And she was concerned about the gap between financial markets and the real economy, something that's still very relevant today.
And what about Bernstein's point about cartels and trusts? He saw them as proof that capitalism could regulate itself, right?
Exactly. He thought they showed that capitalism could avoid crises, but Luxemburg disagreed again.
What was her argument?
She said they were just temporary fixes. They might stifle competition in one industry, but they just shift the problem to a global scale, leading to even bigger crises down the road.
Interesting. So how does that work?
Well, she argued that these big companies could only maintain profits in their home markets by dumping their excess goods on the world market at lower prices. And when that global market gets saturated, those seemingly stable cartels and trusts would crumble, leading to even fiercer competition.
So even if things seem stable for a while, those underlying contradictions of capitalism are still there, waiting to erupt.
Exactly. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. And she also made a compelling political argument.
Oh, tell me about that.
She basically said that reforms, while useful, end up strengthening the power of the ruling class until a revolution can finally dismantle the old order. She even has this great quote about it. She says, "Revolution is the act of political creation, while legislation is the political expression of a society that has already come into being."
I like that. It really captures the difference between working within the system and creating a completely new one.
Right. And for Luxemburg, that was the key distinction.
So looking back at this debate, what does it tell us about acting as philosophers?
It shows that Luxemburg didn't just dismiss opposing viewpoints, she engaged with them directly. She analyzed Bernstein's arguments point by point, using logic and her deep understanding of Marxist theory.
So it was a real intellectual battle, not just a political one.
Exactly. And that unwavering commitment to critical thinking and defending her core principles, that's a key element of her philosophical approach.
Definitely. So after this debate, she went even deeper into the mechanics of capitalism. She wrote The Accumulation of Capital and her Introduction to Political Economy, where she really focused on surplus value.
Right, surplus value. That's basically the unpaid labor that capitalists extract from workers, the source of their profits.
Got it. So what was she trying to understand about surplus value?
Well, one of her most insightful points was a critique of Marx's own analysis in Volume 2 of Capital.
Oh, wow. So she was even willing to critique Marx.
Yeah, she was. She argued that Marx had presented capitalism as a somewhat closed system, not paying enough attention to non-capitalist economies, and she thought that was a big problem.
Okay, so what did she propose instead?
She believed that capitalist accumulation needed access to new, non-capitalist markets to realize surplus value.
Explain that a little more.
Sure. Basically, she argued that the workers within the capitalist system with their limited wages couldn't possibly buy all the goods being produced.
That makes sense. They're being paid less than the value they create, so there's always this surplus of goods.
Exactly. So capital needs to find new markets outside the system to sell those surplus goods. And that's where her analysis of imperialism comes in.
Right. So she argued that this expansion into non-capitalist areas, whether through conquest, trade, or even violence, was essential for capitalism to survive.
It was the way for the system to keep growing and generating profits. And she saw this as a driving force behind things like colonialism, the displacement of indigenous populations, and the creation of a global pool of cheap labor.
And she connected this directly to issues of race and oppression, right?
Absolutely. She saw racism as being deeply intertwined with capitalist exploitation. She famously observed that capital needs other races to exploit territories where the white man cannot work. So racism wasn't just a side effect. It was an integral part of how capitalism expanded globally.
That's a really powerful insight. It really highlights how different forms of oppression are interconnected.
And this led her to view imperialism, the drive of powerful nations to control and exploit weaker ones, as the inevitable outcome of competition among capitalist countries.
They're all scrambling for those remaining non-capitalist markets and resources.
Exactly. Think of historical examples like the Opium Wars, or how international loans were used to create dependency in developing countries. For Luxemburg, these weren't just isolated political events. They were the consequences of this inherent drive for capitalist expansion.
So she was really digging into the underlying economic drivers of global conflict and inequality. Again, acting as a philosopher, not just accepting the surface explanations.
Now, it's important to acknowledge that her economic analysis wasn't without its critics. People like Bukharin and Lenin raised concerns about her interpretation of Marx and her focus on consumption.
What were some of their criticisms?
Well, some felt she was too deterministic, that she saw capitalism as moving in a fixed, predictable direction. Others thought she misinterpreted certain aspects of Marx's economic theories.
Interesting. So even within the Marxist tradition, there were these debates and disagreements.
Absolutely. It wasn't a monolithic block. There were different interpretations and approaches. But even with those criticisms, Luxemburg's insights about finance and the relationship between wealthy and poor countries are incredibly relevant today.
Oh, definitely. She was one of the first to really emphasize the importance of money and credit, in the capitalist economy and to see financial crises as potentially separate from problems in industrial production.
Right. Her work really foreshadowed some of the later economic theories that explore those complexities. So she was pushing the boundaries of economic thought, even challenging Marx himself.
So acting as a philosopher means not just accepting existing frameworks, even those of your intellectual heroes, but constantly questioning them and pushing them further.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about her views on race and national self-determination. It's really striking how attuned she was to issues of race, ethnicity, and indigenous rights, especially given that this wasn't always central to mainstream Marxist thought at the time.
Yeah, that's a really important point. While some thinkers of her era saw history as this linear progression toward more advanced societies, often equating that with industrial capitalism, Luxemburg recognized the devastating impact of European capitalism on pre-capitalist cultures.
She had this stark observation that the encounter with European civilization was deadly, universally and without exception.
It wasn't about romanticizing those pre-capitalist societies. It was about acknowledging the brutal realities of colonialism, the exploitation, the cultural destruction.
Right. And she wasn't just speaking in general terms. She specifically condemned German colonialism, including the horrific genocide of the Nama and Herero people.
Yeah, and she was critical of the SPD for not taking a stronger stance against those atrocities.
Probably worried about losing support from their more nationalist base.
Most likely. But Luxemburg's solidarity extended far beyond Europe. She said that Black people in Africa were just as near to me as the suffering of the Jews.
That's a really powerful statement. It shows her inclusive vision of the fight against oppression.
And it helps us understand her somewhat controversial stance on national self-determination.
Right. While Lenin and many other Marxists saw national liberation movements as a way to weaken imperialism and potentially advance socialism, she was more skeptical.
Her main concern was that those movements could end up serving the interests of local elites, fragmenting the broader workers' movement.
And her own experience with Poland is a good example of that.
Exactly. Even though she was a Polish revolutionary, she argued that genuine liberation for Polish workers required international solidarity, not just creating a separate Polish nation-state.
She worried they'd just be replacing Russian exploitation with Polish exploitation.
Precisely. And you see this willingness to challenge even deeply held beliefs within her own movement based on her analysis of global power. That's acting as a philosopher, right? Thinking critically independently, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Now, another area where she really stands out is her thinking on political organization. Her views were shaped by those contrasting experiences of working-class movements in Western and Eastern Europe.
Right. In the West, there was more emphasis on parliamentary politics and trade unions, while in the East, especially in Tsarist Russia, things were much more underground, spontaneous, and volatile.
And that's where the 1905 Russian Revolution comes in.
A pivotal moment for her. It led her to write The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Union. In that essay, she argued that mass strikes weren't just a tactic, they were the method of motion of the proletarian mass, an inherent part of revolutionary struggle.
So she saw the economic and political struggles as inseparable.
Absolutely. And this is where her idea of spontaneity comes in. It wasn't about rejecting leadership or organization, but about recognizing the capacity of the masses to develop their own understanding and direction during moments of upheaval.
Didn't she say something like, revolutions don't allow anyone to play schoolmaster with them?
Yeah, something like that. She definitely believed that revolutions couldn't be dictated from above.
But wasn't she also criticized for potentially underestimating the need for strong leadership?
Yeah, there's been debate about that. Some argue she was too focused on spontaneity and didn't appreciate the role of conscious leadership enough. But it's important to remember that she also believed in political education and the need for conscious action.
Right, she wasn't advocating for just blind, chaotic action.
Exactly. And when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, she was initially cautious, but she recognized its significance.
She did have some strong criticisms, though, right?
Yeah, she was very critical of the suppression of democracy and dissenting voices. That famous line of hers, "Freedom for supporters of the government only, is no freedom at all." That's a powerful critique of any system that claims to be revolutionary but silences dissent.
And she was worried about the dangers of a one-party state, right?
Absolutely. She warned against the risks of the vanguard party becoming isolated and suppressing different viewpoints. She was a fierce advocate for unlimited democracy, with active participation from the masses, not just ruled by a party elite.
So again, acting as a philosopher, constantly questioning and challenging, even within her own revolutionary movement.
She was committed to those core principles of freedom and democracy, even in the context of radical social change.
And that takes us to our final topic, women's emancipation. There's been a tendency to see her as indifferent to this issue, but recent scholarship paints a more nuanced picture.
Definitely. While she didn't always see the woman question as separate from the critique of capitalism, she was a strong supporter of women's rights.
So what was her perspective?
Well, she was very critical of what she saw as tokenistic feminism, focused just on things like suffrage, without addressing the deeper roots of oppression within the capitalist system.
So not just superficial changes, but getting to the core of the problem.
Exactly. And she had this sharp critique of bourgeois women who fought against male prerogatives, but benefited from the exploitation of working-class women and men. She called them parasites of the parasites.
Wow, that's harsh. But I get her point.
Right. And she understood that women faced this double oppression under capitalism, both in the workplace and in the family. She even anticipated some of the ideas of social reproduction theory, recognizing the importance of the unpaid domestic labor that women traditionally performed.
So she was ahead of her time in that sense.
Definitely. And she was very vocal in criticizing social democrats who compromised on women's suffrage for political gain.
So it wasn't just an abstract intellectual concern for her.
No, it was connected to her understanding of how capitalism exploited and oppressed different groups in different ways. And her support for women's rights wasn't limited to Europe. She was concerned about the plight of women in colonized areas like German Africa, where they faced particularly brutal forms of oppression.
So again, linking different forms of oppression together.
Exactly. And she believes that true emancipation for both women and colonized people could only happen through a radical transformation of the entire system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Rosa Luxemburg's life and thought, it's clear she's a figure who still have a lot to teach us.
She was a passionate advocate for freedom and deeply concerned with the ways that oppression manifests in our world.
And her life is a powerful example of what it means to act as philosophers, engaging with complex issues through rigorous analysis, guided by ethics, and always willing to challenge conventional wisdom.
I think what's so inspiring about her is this constant interplay between theory and practice. She was always learning, always adapting her analysis based on what was happening in the world. That's what it means to be a true philosopher, I think.
And she reminds us that even within revolutionary movements, there's always a need for critical thinking, for debate, for dissent.
Absolutely. She was a powerful voice for those values, even when it was difficult.
So here's a final thought for you. What does it mean for each of us to act as philosophers in our own lives? To critically analyze the world around us and work towards a more just and equitable future? That's something I hope you'll keep thinking about.
I know, I will. It's a challenge worth embracing.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.